Welcome to another episode of Vulgarian Recommends. In this episode, we are going to talk about spring, summer, fall, winter, and spring from 2003, directed by Kim Ki-duk. It's his most famous film, and if you have gotten into Korean cinema at all, you probably have at least heard of this film, as it is one of those big classics of the early to mid 2000s period when Korean cinema was really getting big with again Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon-ho and Kim Ji-woon and other directors like that. And you can often see this in the like top 5, top 10 Korean films of all time lists, and also on the best of 21st century lists. But it's my second favorite Kim Ki-duk film. Again, Three Iron is still my favorite, as I just absolutely love that film, and it's again probably in my top 30 or even top 20. But this film is almost as important to me, and this was my second time watching it. It had been quite a few years since my first watch, and I still loved it as much as I did on my first watch. But I'll give a brief plot synopsis. It has a very simple plot, but it's about this Buddhist temple that's in the middle of this lake, and it's surrounded by these kind of hills and forests. But in that temple, there lives two people. So we have this Buddhist monk and his apprentice, and we follow their journey throughout different seasons and throughout different lives. And this film is structured in a way that it has few different parts. So it starts with the apprentice being a young boy, then a teenager, then an adult, then a middle-aged man, and older guy. Yeah, so it's all about the seasons of life and all the kind of major universal emotions and stuff that we feel throughout our life. But I also put here this short quote from Kim Ki-duk that kind of sums up the basic themes of the film quite well. So I intended to portray the joy, anger, sorrow, and pleasure of our lives through 4 seasons and through the life of a monk who lives in a temple on Chusan, surrounded only by nature. So I think that these are pretty obvious themes if you have seen the film, but I think this might be helpful for people who haven't seen the film to kind of get the idea of what the gist of it is. And it's also this film. Oh wait, I need to put the like title back here, but yeah. So this film is very much Kim Ki-duk's like traditional style. So he loved to make films that which are pretty much silent, that there isn't much dialogue. There is some dialogue here, there's some use of music, but for the most part, it's a very quiet and peaceful film as well. And then there are these kind of small bursts of kind of violence and sex that you kind of get to interrupt the silence, you could say, and that's pretty common for Kim Ki-duk films as well. And then also the methodical cinematography, I would say, is something that you see in many of his films, like in Three Iron and his film The Isle, which is very similar to this film as well. But I think many people start their Kim Ki-duk journey with this one. I'm pretty sure I started with The Isle, and I think Alte started with Three Iron, which I recommended last year. And you can check out that conversation as well. I think still one of our better conversations. I really enjoyed talking about that film. So hopefully our discussion of this film will be as fruitful as that one. But one more thing I'll say before I let Altes talk is that my knowledge on Buddhism, even though I have a Buddha here, is very limited. Like we had like world religion courses at like high school or whatever, and so I've learned a little bit there. And then obviously I've watched lots of Asian films, so I've gotten some sense of it there. But I really don't have any that kind of book smart knowledge about Buddhism and stuff like that. So I think for people who really know Buddhism, they can get even more out of this film, as it is very much about Buddhism, and it has Buddhist symbolism and kind of lots of the major Buddhist teachings in it. But even for atheists like me who doesn't know much about Buddhism, this is such a beautiful film that I love. So you can enjoy it even without knowing much about Buddhism, but I think it would help if you know something about it, so you can get a greater understanding of it.
Yeah, that quote you shared from Kim Ki-duk is very interesting because he's like, I wanted to portray what the joy, anger, sorrow, pleasure, right?
Lust.
Lust, okay, lust as well was in there. But what I find very interesting is how his quote, in some ways, is not exactly what the film. It is about that, but it's not about that because I would almost go and say and question what each of those elements actually are and where they come from. Because I think that's the whole thing. It's not just from taking his quote, it's almost like he's taking a picture and saying, here's a picture of joy, here's a picture of anger, here's a picture of sorrow, here's a picture of lust and pleasure. And and that's not exactly it. It's more than that. It's this multi-dimensional, three-dimensional object, and that where you start questioning what is joy in our life, and where does it come from, and where does it lead, and what is authentic joy and what might be deceiving joy. So I think it's simplistic, or it looks simple, and it's presented in a way that's, someone might say, oh, okay, this is a simple movie, but it's actually way way more contemplative than that. And that's why it's uh, yeah, I'm interested to see our discussion of it, because, or how we discuss it, because in some ways I thought, what's there to discuss? But then when you shared that quote, I was like, actually there's a lot to discuss. So let's see this film that I would describe as this incredible spiritual dream that somehow he's been able to recreate on film. Uh, and It's just a whole experience, this film. And I watched it on this Tartan DVD, which I have to say is slightly disappointing because, yes, you enjoyed the film. It's a great film, but you now start thinking about the umbrella release and the sharper imagery and all that would really benefit the film even more seeing it on like a Blu-ray that Umbrella has put out and stuff like that to get even more out of beauty out of the beautiful film it already is.
Yeah, the part of this film watching experience actually made me quite sad because I think this style of filmmaking is pretty much dead
Mm,
now. We don't get these kind of spiritual, methodical, hypnotic
mm,
masterpieces anymore. I mean, you get some of them in, again, Asian countries like Taiwan, China, Korea, and Japan. But yeah, when you look at American cinema these days, or even European cinema, yeah, you don't really get these types of contemplative masterpieces, or at least I haven't seen them. But I absolutely love this style of filmmaking, this quiet and chill, contemplative, beautiful style of filmmaking that really kind of is in touch with, again, nature and all the universal themes. This is the type of stuff that I could watch very often, but there's just not enough of it. There are some of those slow cinema directors that have some of this still, even though I would say that this is necessarily slow cinema, but it has some elements that kind of similar vibe that some slow cinema films have, but this isn't as, again, slow, especially in terms of like how long the shots are or anything, but it kind of gives you that vibe. But yeah, this is just one of those kind of, I think, last masterpieces of this kind that has come out, at least, again, based on the films that I have seen. So.
yeah, absolutely. I was watching it and I was just shocked. I was like, someone made this in 2003? Like, it's just hard to imagine when you think about films of the 2000s and you think this film. I mean, the courage it takes to make this film in 2003, like you said, when we are so focused on dialogue and exchange and language to and even in 3 Iron with the protagonist that basically doesn't speak, I'm like, this is just really great, and the fact that it can be engaging and how it engages given the minimal dialogue, and and what seems to be a kind of minimalistic film in some ways, which it isn't, but it when you get into it, but just this, and then how you could sit there watching it, and then you say, "Oh, I could have watched this for longer," in a way. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And this very much stands out of even the Korean cinema of this period, because if you think about 2003, I think Old Boy came out in 2003, or was it 2004? Memories of Murder came out the same year. So those are very, very different types of films, even though Memories of Murder has maybe a little bit of like contemplative style, and it has that kind of some nice shots of like grass fields and stuff that, yeah, maybe there's very small resemblance to this film, but overall the Korean cinema of that time was very different to this, because especially because there's lots of focus on kind of like really well made action thrillers and stuff in Korean cinema of that time, but this is this kind of contemplative religious film, a very spiritual film. Even you could make some comparisons to Tarkovsky, even in
Oh
some
yeah,
of the style and stuff. So very different to other films of that time.
yeah. And as an aside, when I was watching this, what I also found interesting is, uh, I mean, I don't know to what extent the allegations made against Kim Kuduk are true or not true or proven true and all that. But one thing I can say is that troubled people can make often very incredible, spiritually contemplative works of art. And so it's interesting, or it's valuable to watch films in this regard too, to kind of watch the film, the art, the expression, and the thought, and then think that it came from may have come from a person who was this troubled, and the process of making the art could have been that problematic, and how what that says about how conflicted we are as human beings, and how much dissonance there is between us, that you could have this potentially problematic behavior while you're making a film of this caliber and quality of art. So it's something really interesting to just ponder as well.
Yeah, and maybe he tackled these subjects of lust and violence because that was his own life as well. So it kind of feels like this might be a little kind of autobiographical, like in terms of the themes, not the story necessarily, but the themes. Yeah.
I think you
And
have a point there as well, like that you say autobiographical, and I just immediately thought, yeah, autobiographical for him, but in a way, autobiographical for all of us, because I guess we'll discuss this more as we discuss the film, but it's a human condition story. It's a human psychology, spiritual condition story, and us unable to know what's best for us because of these psychological pulls and longings and biological pulls and longings, and we don't really recognize the beauty and the potential for beauty in our own life and the potential of joy in our own life. But yeah, that's an overarching theme, I think.
yeah, I started even thinking about Aristotle when you said that, because I wrote an essay about like Aristotle's views on anger and hatred.
Mm.
But obviously this film tackles anger a lot, but like Aristotle said that anger is something that can be cured, when hatred is something that is incurable. But of course here we kind of have that transcendence from anger and lust to something higher in a way towards the end. So it kind of made me think of that. We actually reference Aristotle quite a lot in this podcast for some reason. Usually it's the poetics, but now it's the emotions. But anyway, I think, yeah, people, if you are into contemplative, beautiful, hypnotic art house films, very spiritual, religious films, definitely check this one out. Yeah, I think it's still like a fairly accessible film, even though it's of that tradition that might sound very difficult, but I think it's definitely one of the more accessible films of its kind.
Yeah, if you enjoy journeys where people struggle with their, you know, their faith in the world, in a sense. So it's like, so when you said Tarkovsky, yeah, I immediately think of Andrei Rublev. Even watching this film, I'm like, yeah, it has that elemental quality that's similar to Andrei Rublev, about someone, about how people struggle in their life, their biology, their environment, um, and in society, and then, like you said, in like Aristotle, whatever, that higher spiritual plane, that potential that exists in all of us to transcend that. Like if you enjoy stories about that, there's so many like that. Silence is there, even though I've not seen the original Silence. I've only seen the Scorsese version. I have the original, but I need to watch it. But those kinds of stories, I think you'll like absolutely love this film, because it's magnificent from beginning to end.
Yeah, and this is the type of film that pretty much everybody seems to love it, because I mean it has like 4.2 on Letterboxd, and always see these glowing reviews for it, both from critics and from regular people. So I think, yeah, the chances are that you are gonna love this, especially as you are watching my channel, so you probably are into this type of films. So yeah, but I think we could now move into the kind of spoiler section of this film, although this is the type of film that I don't think the spoilers matter that much, even though there are those plot points there. But in the end, it's more about the themes, the vibe, rather than like a narrative. But I know some people are just, yeah, no spoilers at all. Yeah. So if you are that type of person, yeah, turn off the podcast. So, but yeah, where should we start with this one? Maybe we'll start with the aesthetic a little bit, although I mean, we kind of covered it already, but very hypnotic, these wide shots. And I think the location does a lot of it already, because it's the really beautiful location. It's this lake, and again, the temple is in the middle, and then there's the temple door that's separate from the temple. That's really nice, and kind of adds some to the themes and the aesthetic as well. And the forest is really beautiful, and although the snakes, I hate the snakes, so I didn't enjoy seeing the
Yes.
snakes, because otherwise I would love to go for a hike in a place like that. But yeah, the snakes kind of turned me off. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this, again, like I said, it's you tend to pick films together that have so many connections, either in style or theme. And even though they might be totally different, in that one might be a samurai film, one might be something like this. But once again, the the aesthetic is that, by, like you said, this picturesque surrounding, where you're in there's a lake, surrounded by mountains, so kind of isolated from the world in a way, natural, you know, with natural barriers. Uh, it's creating the fabulistic feel, right? That picturesque feel that in some ways you think of this, like shrine, home slash shrine in the middle of the lake, and then there's a door leading to it. But I just had a thought just when you mentioned the door, which I think I'll mention later. But I just had this very interesting thought. I was like, yeah, I never thought about that. But um, yeah, and you got this. I guess, what would you say? Almost like a naturalistic feel, like naturalistic colors, like you are in nature. It's obviously all films, they do a certain thing with grading and color, and what they're filming with and cameras, but the idea really is that you're very much in this nature, untainted. I think that's what the aesthetic is sort of giving off, is to give off a palette and experience that's doesn't feel pushed or manipulated in any way, doesn't feel altered in any way. It very much feels like, okay, if you're out there living there, that then you can really, it's nature unfiltered and, you know, unmanipulated. So I think that's a great part of it. And again, yes, lots of, I guess, shots of the, you know, the vegetation, the, you know, how the animals and everything like that, just giving that real naturalistic feel. And very much like if you've read any of these Buddhist stories, or stories that are told, this is the world you kind of picture and like that they're happening in. So the aesthetic is meant to create that whole environment, and so the world building is fantastic.
Yeah, the animals all represent different things in Buddhism. Like the animal symbols, I think snake was anger, cat
Okay.
was peace, or being peace with yourself, or something like that. And then dogs is the fidelity to your masters, obviously in the beginning. The student is, or the apprentice is, yeah, very loyal to his master. But then at some point he kind of, yeah, has a mind of his own, more so you could say.
Yeah, and since you're kind of going there, okay, I want to, this thing about the door. And on the door, okay, so first what's interesting is there's this door. So we have this whole, if you've already, and probably everyone who's watching this part has seen it already. So this home slash shrine slash temple is in the middle of the water, and there's a lake, and there's a doorway, but the doorway is not actually blocked by any walls. So there's nothing, from what I recall, there's nothing preventing you from going around the door and going in there. But the way people are always entering and out is going through the door, which is a, now I'm wondering what that means. But the door is itself, like you said, with symbolism. You do see these devil-like. They're like devil-like figures on the door. I'm pretty sure that even in the Buddhist tradition, these are meant to reflect forces of the mind, right? Because I think Buddhism generally, if you were to look at it very simplistically, which is not simplistic, but let's say at the highest level, what would you say? Buddhism is about the mind. It's about the forces of the mind. In a way, there are other aspects that come into play, which we'll talk about. But first is it's about the mind. So maybe this doorway is this, you're entering this world of the mind, and there are devils guarding the door. Um, could mean at times, because to get into yourself, to get into the place of pure contemplation, you have these uh, blockers, these devils, these energies that are our own impulses and stuff like that, that block you, and they stop you at the door, and you almost have to open that door to even start the process of deeper reflection. At least that's what I would speculate.
Yeah, I think there has to be some meaning about the door because they just the film shows it so many times and these different characters going through it. And then, yeah, like you said, it has those two like characters there. Yeah, whether they are devils or demons or whatever they are. Again, I was kind of thinking that what they are because again, my knowledge on Buddhism is so limited. But then, of course, the boat, I think the boat also probably symbolizes something. And we see the boat going through the door and then going back to the temple. And even when when the apprentice is a teenager and he's with the girl and they go have sex, like close to the door, but then they fall asleep and then the boat drifts back to the temple and then the master wakes them up with the boat, like the water and stuff. So what does that mean also in relation to the meaning of the door and stuff? So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like layers. So, as you've always said, that water can often represent, okay, in modern psychology, subconsciousness, like, your subconscious. But overall, sea, I think in Eastern philosophy, especially like Buddhism, you can see that the sea being uh, almost mysterious and unknown is consciousness in itself. So this temple sitting on top of the sea of consciousness almost gave me this idea of the mind, that what sits on top of this consciousness to direct that consciousness. And in what's going to happen there is what's going to determine the overall state of the consciousness. And so the film starts in this, and you have the idea of the cycle, as we've discussed before about Buddhism there too, because even the title, right? Spring, summer, fall, winter, and spring. So, and then you can think, and spring, and then spring could mean enlightenment, consciousness, so you don't return back to summer, fall, winter. Or it could mean that after spring will once again come summer, fall, winter. So that is very much in the tradition, because it's like, as we've discussed, it's a cycle of birth, death, rebirth. So there's a cycle going on earth, and it's going to continue, and it's going to continue for each and every one of us. And enlightenment is the way out. But when you hit enlightenment, so the title is, I don't know if it translates directly from Korean, but in that way it's brilliant, because it does exactly show you the two aspects. Spring, enlightenment, you are now not going back in the cycle, but you can very much fall back and then go back to the cycle again. So it starts with the, like you said, the master pupil relationship. And then by the end of the film, you're already going to question who that original pupil was. Was the pupil coming from, once again, the acts of that master, as we will see later in the story, that sort of happening. So where did this student come from? You'll contemplate again at the end. So, and then it's almost like the birth of consciousness, right? This young child, now we're going to see from, he is going to try to understand the world, and he's going to go into this journey of the world and the mind.
And I started thinking that, okay, most of the things that are relating to anger or lust, or what you could say are these more negative emotions, like they all happen kind of outside the temple, mostly in the forest and stuff. But in the temple, there is this kind of sense of peace and tradition. So maybe, yeah, the kind of temple somehow like resembles, again, the respect for the tradition and the master or your father. But then when you go outside the temple, you go towards your own journey that involves these emotions of resentment and anger and lust, or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Like, I think it's like this, it's a really deeply affecting movie, because you realize, even if you don't know about Buddhism and some of the belief system, you just realize something about life in general that is a perspective you don't often get. Is that this whole desire, right? And Buddhism, desire is a form of attachment, and you're going to see this imagery of attachment everywhere, right? He ties the animals to the rock, and he gets tied to a rock, and the boat gets docked, otherwise it floats away. And there's all this imagery of fetters and being tied, and one of the roots of that is desire, right? And then desire in human beings, it's this flaw we have almost, that we feel that our desire is going to lead us somewhere to result in some sort of satisfaction and requisite requisition and completeness. Like we're gonna complete something, and then we're gonna be complete at the end. Whereas it's this false instinct in us, desire. Like it leads to art, for example. Desire does lead to art or violence or any number of things in this world. Desire is an important part of that, but the idea that desire is going to take and desire to go out into the world, because that's the other thing we see. He now has a desire to go out in the world because the girl leaves the temple, so now it's I got to go out in the world, and I have this desire, and so I'm going to satisfy something. It's like I'm going to satisfy a thirst, but that thirst will never satisfy itself. And in fact, this is very Ozu like as well. It's probably going to lead to 1,000 additional disappointments, only making you realize more and more that what the nature of the world is, and for some result in returning back to that state where you reject the world because you realize that it's just a trap at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I think you can also twist that around, that if you don't go for your desires, you will live in repression, and repression can lead to violence as well, and
Yes,
rejecting the world as well.
yes,
And
absolutely.
that's one of my problems with religion, is the kind of prudeness about sex and stuff and desires, because I don't think that, well, yeah, going for your desires without any thought, obviously that's bad as well, but I don't think the answer to that is repression and being prude and stuff like that either.
Yeah, and I think that this is where, if you don't know that much about Buddhism, then I think there's naturally, yes, the Western way of saying that what this means is a repression versus rejection. And I think the rejection is that, see, the child story in a way mirrors Buddha's story. Not exactly, but in some ways, because the Buddha's story is that, okay, he's born a prince and he has all the earthly pleasures and all that. So he partakes in the world. So I think that the significant part is when he says to the priest or his father or whatever that figure is, I have sinned. The response is it's natural. So it's that, and Buddhism is complicated in that way because Buddhism is, there's the spiritual side and then there's the whole side of the monastic side, which is very different depending on where you are in the world and which monastic tradition and all that stuff. So it gets way, 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 way complicated, and I can't claim to be an expert on that. But one thing is that you do have to taste life. So it's not that it's wrong that he tasted life, but it's that maybe he wasn't prepared for the power of desire. That at the end of the day, yes, this film potentially resolves in the retreat and rejection, but like you said, I think it's also asking the question that may be the answer if you're not prepared for what the world is. It's like you should have your desire, but like you said, uncontrolled desire, or putting expectations on what that at the end of that desire, what that's going to resolve. Like you fall in love with this woman, but the you not being prepared that she could love someone else is a disappointment of life that you can prepare for in a way in the mind and say, okay, that can happen. But that desire leading to obsession and saying, no, it cannot be any other way except that what I need needs to be resolved in my favor, then you're leading into a whole other world, which is the world of Sword of Doom in its sort of a way, if you think about it.
Yeah, and if you only follow your desires and pleasure, of course, that leads to hedonism, and in that way you can numb all your morals and values, and then it can, at worst, result even in nihilism. But what was the other point I was gonna make? Yeah, of course, I think part of Buddhism is also kind of the certain beauty of living in simplicity and accepting, or is it a kind of cruel part of life and all the pain and suffering and things like that, but then somehow transcending that, and that again reminded me of Tony Soprano, that enjoy the little moments. So yeah, enjoy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the Zen of Tony Soprano is a very interesting idea as well, that even in a very sociopathic individual, could there be moments of Zen as well? That's an interesting also, thought. And it's also like this, when the child is looking at the master, he's seeing the master as someone who's never experienced what they've experienced. So in a way, there's the Buddhism aspect, but I think what's also touching is it's just the story of life. When you're a child and you look at your so-called teachers and the things that people are modeling life for you, or telling you, stay away from this, don't do this, don't do that, your thought is they've never done a bad thing in their life. And it's like, as you grow, you realize, oh, they may have just done exactly what I've done, and then they've realized how it can mislead you. And now I'm in that position. So there's this whole question that even when he does the whole sutra and all this stuff and makes him carve it out to deal with his anger, you start thinking in that moment, is this the first time, or has this master had to do that himself? And so that's what lends this layer of beauty. And then you, like I said, it's Ozu like in that way, that there's intergenerational conflict, but then there's no intergenerational conflict in some ways, because in life, it's like we often repeat the same thing over and over and over. We just don't know. We just think that the previous generation's not like us, or when they're telling us, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, it means they never did it. But it's more like, I did it, but then ultimately you realize this, and it's like this, the point you made in our previous chat, where you said, was Shimada exactly like Ryosuke? And then he just realized this is not the way, and that's why he's the teacher. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's very much about that cyclical nature, how people in the end are always the same,
Yeah.
no matter what century or decade we are looking at. All that basic, or even like different countries, that the human experience is very universal, that there are those kind of key cornerstones in everybody's life that we always repeat year after year. Yeah.
Yeah, but you raised an important point earlier as well, because you were talking about, I don't think desire just means it's always bad and you be repressed. And I think, yes, there's a question there, that in this particular story, desire led to killing. But if that's the case, then we'd all be constantly killing, which we are not. So clearly there's something that desire can lead to killing, but that doesn't mean that it always lead to killing. And what is it that's the difference between desire leading and killing and desire not leading and killing? And one of the things might be this concept of letting go, where even he's asked when he comes back, and he's like, oh, you followed all of them, and he's like, and you couldn't let this go. He asks this question, and I think that goes back to some of that imagery about these ties that pull us and bind and slow down our progress, and can result in death. Because if we can't get around this obstacle and we remain tied to this rock, and the rock could be the source of your hatred and anger and whatever, then you got a problem. But clearly all of us feel desire, and all of us are not out there killing everyone, so that are blocking us from our desire. But on a psychological level, are we still conflicting in the same way? I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and what relates to that, I think, is what you also said earlier, that he wasn't prepared for the desire. But if you are prepared, then you know how to let go. But again, when his wife cheated on him, his response was to kill his wife. But if he was prepared for all the awful things that happen in life, yeah, he would be sad because his wife cheated on him, but he wouldn't kill her. But then, of course, he returns back to the temple, and then he does he writes the letters and stuff. But then I think the master gives him the cat, and apparently cat uh, symbolizes peace. So we can see how he ends up finding peace after that when he returns to the temple.
Yeah, and I mean, this raises even so many more questions about the story, because on the surface, like you said, it's like this kind of story where you say, is it basically saying reject the world? And now I'm starting to think, well, I don't know, because this is not just about Buddhism as a faith, but then the different monastic traditions, but certain practices, Buddhist practices, in you know, which is they send children in many countries. They send children when they're young to actually monasteries to stay there for a while. So some children are sent right away, and I wonder if there's a whole other way to look at it, to say, if you live in a way that's just fully rejecting the world, then it's like how you can't really prepare for it, right? Because you see him as he's sitting there, he doesn't know anything of the world, and in a way he's in a sense of joy and innocence and peace. Then in comes this force, which is this girl that he falls in love with, and then you know he experiences biological desire, love, lust, and a different kind of physical pleasure, but emotional joy and even spiritual joy, because in these belief systems, it's not like one form of energy is rejected. In a way, the man woman is a unification and a complete energy, uh, that's meant to be there in all of us. We're not just saying, oh, male energy, let's just sit there and this is one of those, like, no women and you're all good. I don't think it's necessarily that simple. But because of all that, he knows nothing about the world, and so he's not prepared to go, like you said, he's not prepared to go out there, and he has no knowledge of it. So as the like I said, went back to the Buddha lived life, and he was protected from the terrible things about life, and then in his journey he goes and discovers, okay, old age, sickness, impermanence, death, and then he realizes how illusory his life has been, being kept inside a palace and being protected from everyday life and all the ills of life. And then he decides to reject those, um, that protected life he has for the life of aesthetic. And then it's more complicated, because then he tries to follow different traditions, and each one is extreme, and he says this is not the way and this is not the way, and he finds a middle way. So Buddhism is really about balancing life and the pleasures of life, and then the reality of life. So there, I think there is this little bit of this duality going on there as well, because it's like there's a piece here, but then he doesn't have knowledge, and then he has to go and get that knowledge, and then based on getting that knowledge, he's then learning about his own nature and what he didn't understand about his nature before, and he couldn't have known that if it was never tested, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think there is that idea that there is an asymmetry between pleasure and pain, that there is more pain in the world and less pleasure. I think even Schopenhauer talked about that, and I'm pretty sure Schopenhauer was influenced by Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, at least to some extent, so maybe that comes from there. And then a completely separate point that came to me is that this would have been a good double bill with the nun, because that exposed the religious kind of, again, repression, while this maybe shows that maybe you should, or maybe that lust and stuff is part of life, but then maybe you transcend it and abstain from it later on, while the nun is about someone who is repressed, and then she escapes, again, the nun life, but then ends up killing herself anyway. So there are some parallels there, but they are kind of two different ways to explore similar themes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is like very interesting to watch in conjunction with different spiritual films, like we even said Andrei Rublev and stuff, and then compare and contrast and all that, and kind of see how they're different, how they're similar. Yeah, it would be beautiful to kind of go deeper into that. And one thing that we didn't talk about at the beginning, because I think the themes are so exciting to talk about in this film, is just the striking imagery, right? The striking imagery when he's writes the close, and just putting on his mouth and eyes and ears, and like that imagery, the shots. Yeah, it's just they haunt you, don't they? Like the whole scene of self-immolation, like when the master is just ready to say that's it, and you thought it makes you think about that death, that if he was all alone and all that, and and then he wants to take care of his own death. I mean, that imagery is so striking. That imagery where that woman comes with the face covered in the winter. There's just so much striking imagery and beauty, and then so much heartbreak and things that disturb you.
And I wonder, going back to the themes as well, that obviously I think this film is all about kind of accepting the reality of life, but should we accept all the suffering? Because if we accept it, we can kind of become numb in a way and kind of stale and not do anything about it, while maybe we should accept it, but at the same time trying to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. But too much acceptance can be a bad thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing, right? And that just goes back to that whole idea that this is what the world is. There's no, if you choose to live in the world, that's what the world is. You're going to be tied to these things. You're going to feel these challenges. You're going to feel this heartbreak. Like you said, there might even be asymmetry between how much pleasure you're going to get and how much pain. And if you're prepared for that, or as you learn those lessons, you learn the lessons and you go on, you'll be all right. But if you're trying to, and then this is the whole question, whether there is a transcendence or not, because, but let's say there is, then yes, then you have to find a way above these things and live a whole different life. And that's why in the beginning I said, his quote about, to show you what joy, anger, sorrow, loss, pleasure, all this is in life, and the different seasons of those things, there's an embedded question of what is joy, because him uniting with someone he falls in love with is a form of joy. But him, sitting there living this simple life with his master or father or whatever is also a form of joy. He could have lived there forever, and that's not like his world would be devoid of joy. It would just be different joy. So what is joy? What is, what is pleasure, lust? What is pleasure? What roots, what are the roots of those things? It's much more intricate than we think, and we make many assumptions about each and every one of those things.
Yeah, and we could even put it this way, that joy could be the absence of suffering. And of course, when you are a place like that, there is a point there that you don't have to work your ass off in a alienating job in the city. You can just be there, relax, and not like really. Also, you don't have to how do you say it? You don't have to be like other people want you to be because you are there by yourself or with your master. You can kind of do your own thing, be yourself, and not have the pressure from other people and from the kind of average contemporary life. So definitely in that life there might be less suffering, but also less joy. But then as you don't have to suffer as much, you kind of get joy from that.
Yeah, that's a loaded thing, what you're saying, because if you go with this definition, joy is the absence of suffering. And if the reality of life is some sort of suffering in one way or another. You might suffer not having the pleasure of having a family, for example, right? That is a form of suffering, and then it becomes a joy if you stop, if you rearrange your mind to not see that as a suffering. It's but I think the big point is that not indifference of life, but not attachment to life. So when you see him on the lake ready to end his life, he's showing a lack of attachment to this life. That right? Okay, there was beauty all around him, but and yet he's like, okay, it's time to go. So there's this, I'm not attached to this life. But we do see, even when you see the paper, you do see that he's experiencing tears. So he is experiencing sadness at the loss of life. And if you are purely, fully in that completely unfettered state, you would feel nothing. You would just say, this is the life, this is life, but that's life, and there's nothing to. So he does feel some sadness. So he's still attached in one way or another still. So I think there's some profound things there that in this spiritual dream, what are we to fully take from it? I don't think it's one particular thing, as you said. It's many different things is what we're supposed to take from it.
Yeah, and of course there is certain positive sides to suffering in a way that we learn often more from suffering than we learn from joy. And it's hard to grow as a person if our life was like a perfect hedonistic dream, even though that's maybe the thing that, yeah, it would be good if the world was just that perfect apple pie candy floss life where there wasn't any anything bad happening ever. But then at the same time, we would lose so much of our humanity if that was the case.
Yeah, so true. And it just goes to show you that a film like this, where if we were just to talk about the plot, it seemed like the simplest thing in the world. Like what actually happens, or what are the kind of plot points, and what on what is the narrative. But the plot points are simple. But I would guess the narrative is not, because it's taking you in all these different places. But the way it's doing it has nothing. It is incredible in that the way it's doing it is just through imagery, in combination of imagery, not even that much by dialogue. You're not even being pulled so much by any dialogue telling you something. It's just what you're going to look at and what you're going to place together as the audience is the narrative, and that the narrative is like highly complex. At least that's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, and this is something me and Tony often talk about, how we often don't like those films or stories that are very kind of plot driven, plot heavy, that there's plot, 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 plot. But oftentimes these simple plots have way more themes to them. But when it's all about plot, like, I don't know, Christopher Nolan film, then there's not much space for themes. It's just plot twists that don't really have any meaning behind them. It's just intricate plot, but nothing more. But this film is a perfect example of a simple plot that kind of tells us so many essential things about the human condition. And oftentimes these simple plots just do that way better than a complex plot. Although, of course, there are exceptions to these rules, as always.
I think you're absolutely right. And in some ways, heavily plotted story is mostly distracting you, right? That's the fun of it. You just go down this thing and you're like, oh, this thing and this. So it's more about exciting you, entertaining you, or distracting you more than. And I think that's the thing, that when you strip it down, then it's like, like when we saw Nostalgia. Nostalgia it's stripped down. There's nothing plot related that any plot points in Nostalgia, but that's stripping down to get somewhere even deeper, more reflective is, yeah, it's a common thing. You see that a lot, and I guess that's why all three of us, we all love Ozu, because that's exactly it. I'm gonna take all this away so I can take you deeper, which whereas I can give you all these plots, but I'm just taking you from here and here, and it's great in a different way. It excites the human drama aspect of it, and I think that's why this film, and even sort of Doom, which we discussed earlier, is kind of cool, because in some ways they're not heavily plotted. There's a promise of all this plot, but it's really this stripped down but taking you really deeper in some ways type films, which are just, I love them as well.
Or even something like Drive My Car or
Yeah.
Romeo films, like so much. Drive My Car tells us so much about communication and grief and trauma, human relationships, but it's a very simple plot where not much happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And even getting back to this film, in some ways, the teacher slash father character teaches us something as well, because he's hardly shaming him per se, or really punishing him, except when he's doing things of cruelty to nature, right? But generally, he's not fully opposing him, fully locking him up. He's just there to serve and provide, counterpoints and things for consideration, which teaches a lot about, I guess, the approach we can take when we see these things in other people and say, well, that's part of the human condition. It's not something to really chastise when it's all in all of us. We are all supposed to just stand as a counterpoint and be there. Like his ability to accept him even after he returns back a killer is, I think, a huge thing. That's the huge compassion aspect of it as well.
And even when he again sees that again the woman and the apprentice in the boat, like after that he says that it's all natural and normal, it's part of human life. He doesn't like shout to him that how dare you have sex or anything like that,
Yeah.
like a Christian priest would probably do. But yeah, he is more just accepting and guiding him through a different path after that. So,
Yeah. I think, yeah, in that way it's important as well. And like we were discussing earlier, might be the way someone is trying to resolve their own conflicts, right? Kim Kiduk's own conflicts that he may have and be experiencing. Sometimes that's why it's important to separate the art from the person, as much as it's difficult to do that. Sometimes the art reflects a consciousness and a revelation of the conflicts that we can all relate to and learn from. And if it's always the person and the art together, then you're going to have a big problem, because you're never going to get these kinds of insights, because troubled people make great art. That's just unfortunately the thing. It's great. Hardly would come from, sorry to say, but probably, I feel that conflict too, that I think if the world stops having all these issues, then we're probably not going to get great art, because what's that art going to be, really? But I don't know that. We've never existed in that state of the world. So, but yeah.
Yeah, that's what I always also say, that to people who say that, oh yeah, I only watch art from good people, but that just limits your experience so much. Even though I do understand that maybe you don't want like monetarily support like awful people and stuff like that, so you maybe not get books from awful people and give them money, but and get them maybe used or something like that. But I think you will lose so much if you just again experience art from quote unquote good people, and then you never know, they could have skeletons in their closet as well. And I think it's important for us to understand the mind of these quote unquote bad people and what they experience, and through their art we can kind of get a glimpse of their mind as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is a whole different area, isn't it? With like the whole good people, bad people, and then art by like good people. But then if the art has lots of violence or whatever, and is providing that, that's okay because it's from a good person. I mean, I think you start getting into a lot of the areas. I think, as you always express it, it's that you just need to be able to exist in a complex world. Like, someone is going to have certain beliefs and then they're going to create certain art, and you just have to study each of them and think about each of it, and then in the same way be allowed to hold competing thoughts. Like, one of the things is that then there's the other side of it, that I see something, uh, you know I like, so therefore I have to fully agree with the person who made it, and I can't say a bad thing about them. That's also a thing. Like, a figure can have heroic, some like positive constructive qualities, but that doesn't mean that you can't entertain a bad thing about them either. It's I know it's like off track, but I think in some ways it relates to the film as well, because we're going back to the world of, non-judgment, but observation and acceptance that this is the life. Like, he's not like, oh my God, I raised you with these principles, and then you went and out and killed somebody. Like,
Yeah, and I think again the best approach, in my opinion, is that we should separate the art from the artist, but we should also acknowledge the fact that these artists might be bad people. We shouldn't like ignore that part completely.
yes, of
But
course.
it's more in the middle that you can enjoy a Kim Ki-duk film, but at the same time say that, yeah, he wasn't the best person out there. Or even like last night, I had a nightmare about the mystery man from Lost Highway. And
Oh
that guy, obviously, he's creepy in Lost Highway, but I think the actor also killed somebody in real life. But I'm a
oh yeah.
big fan of his performance there. But I can also acknowledge he was probably a terrible person. He was, as he killed somebody.
Yeah, as you said. And then you can also enjoy film, music, and all that, and then embrace and enjoy it regardless of, it might have a problematic element. I think that's the other thing, that as soon as it's a problematic element, you can't identify the problematic element, because that ruins the thing. So therefore, you should never raise it, because it ruins the thing. And it's like, well, maybe it doesn't ruin the thing. Maybe you just say, yeah, this is what it is. I watch Hitchcock and I say, well, I don't know, he's a bit misogynistic. So, like, you can see it in his stories, and what is, it doesn't ruin it, right? You can still enjoy it, but you can be aware of it at the same time too.
And of course, you also have to think about the time when the things came out. You
Yeah,
cannot just put the
exactly.
current day morality for something from 19th century or whatever.
And so I think, again, yeah, since you mentioned time, once again, this movie being made in 2003 is really something. Well, around 2003, it's like very special, because we were at this turn of the century, where heading to this technological age, and we're always going to be doubling and tripling our technological capacity, and there are going to be new devices and this and that. So it's an interesting thing that it's like a time that was sort of opened up with things like The Matrix, and then a film like that falls in, which takes us way back to very elemental spiritual struggle in the human condition. It's a nice opposition, luckily, that we have, but I guess we see it in some of the other filmmakers as well, in Zvyagintsev and Chelan and Hamaguchi and all this, that there is a counterpoint, which is very nice to see. And Kim Kodak himself, Three Iron and all that.
Yeah, I think this conversation is a bit over an hour long now, so maybe we should start wrapping it up. Yeah, this was definitely, at least to me, quite challenging film to talk about. Maybe next time I watch it, I will try to read some more about Buddhism, and I will want to do that anyway at some point, because I am interested in kind of human thought in general, while I'm more interested in like political philosophy and stuff like that, but I am also interested in religion and why people think certain ways. So I do want to learn more about Buddhism at some point. So we'll see how that goes, and maybe we will return to Kim Ki-duk in the future. Like my favorite one out of the ones Altessa hasn't seen yet is called The Isle, which is really good film in my opinion, and I think it was also released by Umbrella at some point. So who knows? Maybe we'll talk about that one at some point. And then there are a couple others that I've seen. One is called Samaritan Girl. I think it's available on some DVD, and I like that one a lot. And then there are also many that I haven't seen and that I want to watch, but sometimes they can be a bit hard to track down.
Yeah, most definitely.
And then in a few weeks, we will talk about 2 more films. One is called Manila in the Claws of Light by Lino Brocca. So it's our first film from the Philippines that we will talk about. So that will be interesting. And then with it, we will talk about Conan the Destroyer. So we finally go back to the mythos of our podcast in a way. So that will be nice. And again, that will be a double bill where the films don't really resemble each other at all. But although maybe we'll come up with some angle where they are similar. Maybe they both explore masculinity in a way.
Yeah, let's see.
And with Conan, I also want to talk about Red Sonja at some point, maybe in the summer, which is kind of like a Conan film, a bit similar, but not a Conan film. So,
Absolutely, that'll be great.
And then there's that Jason Momoa remake of Conan as well. I don't know, maybe we won't talk about that, even though I like Jason Momoa.
Yeah, I do like him as well, yeah.
But yeah, let us know what you think about this film and Kim Ki-duk and Korean cinema in general. Thanks for watching. Don't drink Coke at all. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.